The Depression also exacted a tremendous psychological and emotional toll. We think about the Depression in terms of the economy. It's an economic depression, but it also has this literal sort of psychological and emotional impact as well. People were depressed. At the same time, most people survived and tried to cope with the Great Depression and live through it however they could. Perhaps some of you have had opportunities to talk to your grandparents or it might be great-grandparents at this point in time. Most of them will tell you that they just got through it. They did whatever they had to do. A phrase of that era went that we didn't go hungry, but we lived lean. Well, a lot of people did go hungry, but everyone was living lean. They were tightening their belts. They didn't have any kinds of luxuries or extras. Certainly all the kinds of conveniences and things that we live with today, people just had to do without, but they got through it. One writer commented this way: "I've lived in cities for many months, broke, without help, too timid to get in bread lines. I've known many women to live like this until they simply faint on the street from privations, without saying a word to anyone. A woman will shut herself up in a room until it is taken away from her, and eat a cracker a day and be as quiet as a mouse." So many people were too proud to ask for help. They were ashamed, which only adds to their kind of depression and their emotional state. There was, we can only imagine, a tremendous amount of stress on their lives. As one man wondered, "What is to become of us? I've lost 12.5 pounds this last month just thinking." You can't sleep, you know. You wake up at 2 a.m. and you lie and you think. At the same time, one of the ways that people got through this depression was by trying to maintain normality, act natural, do the kinds of things that you would normally do to keep yourself busy. It was said that people's homes were never cleaner because they were cleaning constantly. Their fences were never whiter because people would paint their fence over and over again just to keep themselves busy. There was also a tremendous amount of neighborhood cooperation, whether formally or informally. Neighborhoods formed networks and associations to help each other out. People understood that for a brief stretch, yes, I might have a job, I might be doing reasonably well, but next week, next month, it might be me who is out of a job and out on the street. And so neighbors really looked out for each other during this time. Truck drivers might accidentally take a corner too hard going around a curve and dump a load of oranges out on the street in a neighborhood, or dump a load of coal on the street in a neighborhood. There are stories of the homeless people, the hobos, developing elaborate networks of chalk markings, almost a secret language, telling them which homes might share some food or spare change, which ones were more likely to turn them away. And so, as much as people do recall the suffering and the hard times, they also remember the sort of cooperation that people helped each other through this time to get through this suffering together. Families as well did what they had to do to get through this period of suffering. That's the other thing that many of the survivors of the Depression recall, is a sense of family cooperation, everybody pitching in as best they could. The Depression generation develops a notorious sense of miserliness or frugality. Even years later, after prosperity had returned and they may have had the means to spend money, members of the Depression era often refused to spend any money. They would save it even if they had money to spend. As one woman commented, "The great majority reacted by thinking money is the most important thing in the world. Get yours and get it for your children. Nothing else matters. Not having that stark terror of losing your savings come at you again." And perhaps you, again, have experiences or have talked to members of your own family who lived like this. I was able to talk to my grandparents several times about their experience during the Great Depression. And one thing that I remembered about one set of grandparents in particular is that when we were children and we would visit their house, it was a terrible place to visit. We never had any fun because they didn't have anything. Like they never bought anything. And years later we realized they had money in the bank, but they would not spend it on anything because of their recollections of the Depression era. They would also do things like save bits of tinfoil, save bits of string. You'd look through the drawers in their house, and there were all these kind of crazy little things that most people would just throw it out. But that Depression learned you don't throw anything out. You reuse it, you save it, you kind of stretch every resource you have. In the Depression-era families, everyone worked. Everyone who could get a job worked. You see a picture here. This is a farm family, of course. So it's more common, I suppose, for children to work on farms. But even in the cities, children worked at times in the factories. Children worked in the home, doing things like rolling cigars or anything else that they could do to pitch in. And it was a phenomenon of the Depression that in some cases women could find jobs, or even children, younger people could find jobs, but the men in the family found themselves out of work because their wages would have been higher. And so, again, this takes a psychological and emotional toll because everybody is kind of out of place. The male breadwinner in the family is now forced to kind of sit at home jobless. The woman is now working. The children are trying to pitch in however they could, and everyone is sort of out of their comfort zone. All of these kind of factors contributed to a lot of family strife. And yet, interestingly, we don't see dramatic increase in the rate of divorce during the Great Depression, even though the cliche has it that people fight about money more than anything, and obviously that would have led to a lot of fighting during the Depression. But people simply could not afford to get a divorce because it's so costly. They had to stay together and try to stick it out. One thing we do know is that the birth rate during the Great Depression declined. Essentially, for the first time in our nation's history, we see couples, families making conscious decisions about how many children they are going to have. Prior to the Great Depression, for the most part, people just had children as many or as few as nature dictated. But now, during the Great Depression, children are a burden. Children are another mouth to feed. They're an expense. And so parents more and more began talking about and arriving at decisions. How many children can we afford to have? And birth control is definitely on the rise during the Great Depression. And we will continue to see how the birth rate rises and falls as the economy itself rises and falls. And so many Americans, pushed to the brink of desperation, searched for assistance in the midst of the Great Depression. In the early years of the Depression, during the Hoover administration, prior to FDR and the New Deal, sources of federal aid were very limited. We're going to talk about Hoover more shortly, but he, in essence, disagreed with the idea that the federal government should take responsibility for caring for the needy. And so during his administration, there were only a handful of federal efforts to assist those in need. What about one's employer, a business or factory, whatever it might be? Well, as we've discussed, the reality is that most businesses were slashing wages, were laying off workers, and in some cases shutting down. So, first of all, you had to be employed to approach your employer. But second of all, in all likelihood, they were not going to be able to help you either. Banks as well. We've talked about their situation, many banks being forced to shut down. It was harder and harder to get any kind of loan during the Great Depression. So what about churches? I've described to you in a previous lecture that churches have long been a source of social welfare, oftentimes in a nation where sources of such welfare were very limited. But when we think about the nature of the Great Depression and people losing a lot of their savings, not having very much money, what's one of the first things that people cut back on in times of need? Among the first things would be putting money in the offering plate or charity, giving money to churches. So many churches found themselves without a whole lot of ability to help either. And so what we have in those early years of the Great Depression is an unpredictable array of soup kitchens or bread lines, which might derive from individuals helping out at any one time or another, churches themselves helping out. At times, state or local governments might put something together, but most of these sources of aid were very unpredictable, changed from day to day, and people literally didn't know where their next meal was coming from. The president overseeing the country during the early years of the Great Depression was Herbert Hoover. Hoover is widely regarded as one of our worst presidents, ranked by most such measures in the bottom three, and considered by many the very worst president we've ever had. Now, I'm not much interested in defending his presidency. It was certainly an awful time, perhaps the worst time in American history. But I do think we need to understand Herbert Hoover in his entirety. And it is somewhat sadly ironic that it was Hoover in the White House as the Great Depression set in, because in many ways we would have expected Hoover to be the perfect man to guide us through a time of great suffering and need in our nation's history. So let me tell you just a little bit about Herbert Hoover and his background, because I think his career prior to the presidency tells us a great deal about this man who is widely considered the worst president we've ever had. He was born in Iowa to Quaker parents. He was deeply devout and essentially lived a life of caring for those in need. He graduated from Stanford University, became an engineer, a career that led him to Europe just as World War I was breaking out. And in fact, Herbert Hoover stayed on in Europe during and after the war and was widely celebrated for his humanitarian efforts, particularly in war-torn Belgium in the aftermath of the war. Somewhat more controversially, he also helped to aid those in Russia. He was named Secretary of Commerce in the 1920s. And so again, ironically, if there's any one man who's responsible for the Roaring Twenties, it may very well be Herbert Hoover. He returned to prominence in 1927 when he spearheaded Red Cross relief efforts in the midst of some of the worst floods in our nation's history. The Mississippi River burst the levees on both sides of the river, and so the middle part of the country, all through Mississippi and Arkansas and Louisiana, was underwater. And Herbert Hoover spearheaded relief efforts for those people who were stranded during that horrible flooding. And so in many ways that was the enduring vision that Americans had of Herbert Hoover as we headed into the presidential election in 1928, is this man whose entire career has been built on helping those in need. Hoover, during his campaign, spoke of the nation eradicating poverty and eradicating need and so on. Obviously, again, it's ironic that this is the man who had to confront the Great Depression. So for someone who obviously cared about helping those in need and who had spent a lifetime doing exactly that, why did he turn out to be such a terrible president during the Great Depression? Well, part of it was based on a number of his core beliefs about the nature of assisting the needy. He believed, first and foremost, in volunteerism, that aiding those in need was a volunteer effort. And in fact, he himself had volunteered many times in his life to help those in need, but he did not think it was the role of the federal government to do that. And so as the Depression begins to set in, Hoover more or less is looking at everyone else around the country and saying, well, listen, you should volunteer. Your company should help out. Your local government should help out. Your state should volunteer to help out, but not the federal government. He also believed, and it's a phrase that comes into vogue later, but he believed in trickle-down assistance. And so he did not believe in handouts to the needy or direct aid to the needy. He believed perhaps in supporting businesses, in supporting banks, larger entities, and then that assistance would trickle down to those at the bottom. We've come to understand after decades of similar kinds of efforts that a lot of times trickle-down assistance doesn't work. Too often the support and the assistance that is provided at the top is kind of siphoned off, and whatever does reach the bottom of the trickling process is so watered down and minor that it doesn't do any good. And of course, during the Great Depression, when 25% of the country is unemployed, well, nothing is trickling down to them. They needed direct assistance. Among the other things that Hoover believed and which became problematic as the Depression worsened were that depressions were just sort of a natural part of the economic cycle that will work themselves out. In his defense, and again, I'm not sure that I entirely want to defend him on this point, but this had always been true up to that point. The Great Depression really is the first time that the nation undergoes such a severe depression that it seemed it would never have recovered on its own. In the past, depressions had been fairly short-lived, and the nation had just sort of recovered naturally. He also believed in personal thrift and hard work. In his view, poverty and unemployment, these things were personal failings. And so he comes from a bit of that social Darwinist background that, again, really leads to him not doing as much as he might have to help during the Depression. So Hoover early on attempted to kind of boost the morale of the American people by making speeches, talking about how the Depression was ending and the country was on the road to recovery. But with the passage of time, it became more and more clear that, in fact, the nation was not on the road to recovery. And so with an election approaching in 1932, with the country clearly bottoming out, even Hoover was forced to break down and concede that the federal government had to do some things to help in the process. So we should never have it said that Hoover did nothing to help during the Great Depression. That's simply a misstatement. He did do something. Some people argue that he did more than any president prior to him had ever done from the perspective of the federal government. The problem with that, of course, is that he's immediately followed by a man who does far more than Hoover himself did. The other problem is that for every good thing that he tries to do with his power in the federal government, he seems to do something equally bad. In other words, he kind of counteracts whatever his good actions are with something that's even worse on the other end. So I'll give you a few examples of this. In 1932, Hoover encouraged the passage of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. This is an example of trickle-down assistance. It provided loans and assistance to businesses and to banks. And it's relatively small and limited compared to some of the programs we'll see in the New Deal, although it's the same idea as what we will see in the New Deal. Similarly, Hoover signed the Public Works Bill that Congress passed in 1932. Although somewhat reluctantly, he really never did support the idea of public works, but understood that at this point, even he could not deny that something like this was necessary. Again, very small in scale compared to the programs of the New Deal. And yet, as I mentioned, for these good and positive and helpful programs, he does equally bad things. I mentioned to you earlier in the lecture the Hawley-Smoot Tariff, which he signed in 1930, the highest tariff ever passed up to that point, essentially shut off trade right at the moment when the country desperately needed outlets for the many products that it was producing at that time. And in 1932, in order to finance programs like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and the Public Works Bill, Hoover actually authorized a tax increase during this incredible time of economic need. Again, we understand today that the proper course of action when the economy is not good is to cut taxes. And you hear an awful lot of that in any kind of political campaign in the modern era. We've cut taxes almost constantly over the last 10 or 15 years. You don't raise taxes in times of need. And so, as the election approaches in 1932, and with nothing working out in Hoover's favor, it is clear that he is not the man to get us out of this crisis. And the bonus army, that disastrous episode, in some ways is the final nail in the coffin. And so in that election in 1932, the country goes looking for another candidate, and the man that they find proves to be one of the greatest presidents in our nation history, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.